You go to me. Okay, we're ready. 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Atheist Christian Book Club, a monthly gathering of atheists and Christians respectfully discussing books from both perspectives. This is our December edition, 2018, last one for the year. Excited to have you guys here. We had quite a few last-minute cancellations because combination of weather or illness, things like that. Traffic's terrible for those of you who come from quite a ways to be here. We've also got an audience via Facebook Live, and if you're watching by Facebook Live and want to participate, Daniel's going to be monitoring. Where's Daniel? Daniel's monitoring our board on that. So if you have a question or comment, just put it in the comments section below. We'll try to get that going as well. Our book for today, we're going to be discussing The Devil's Delusion by David Berlinski. David Berlinski is kind of an odd situation here with him. He is not a Christian. He's a secular Jew. I think he would call himself agnostic. But he is somewhat an opponent of evolution. And so the subtitle of this book is Atheism and its Scientific Pretensions. And so he's kind of the opposite guy. We had a guy earlier in the year. We looked at the book on a similar topic called The Language of God by Francis Collins. Here's a guy who is unquestionably evangelical Christian, but he completely, he was head of the Human Genome Project and completely accepts pretty much all the premises of evolution, including common ancestry, but he's an evangelical Christian, and he made a case for why he feels like that's very compelling, and we read that, talked about that. Well, David Berlinski is kind of the opposite of that. So he is a agnostic, secular Jew, but is very much raises a lot of questions. How many of you got to read the book? Okay, or listen to the audio? Any of you get to watch the videos that I suggested, the little talk, addicted. So I'm going to turn it over to our co-founder. I'm the Christian. My name is James Walker. I'm the Christian co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. The atheist co-founder here, Bill Cluck. Bill, is when you read the book, as coming from an atheist perspective, what were your thoughts?
Well, one of the interesting things was about well evolution. He compared it to like a 1972 Gran Torino turning into a Nautilus sub. And I thought, wow, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So I went, well evolution, what's that all about? So I looked, and it's amazing. Pakicetus is kind of like a wolf-like creature with 4 legs and so forth that ultimately is the transitions into an aquatic whale. And it's a series of transitions. You have the Ambulocetus, which is the walking, swimming whale, about 3 million years after Pakicetus, and it gets to be more, streamlined. Hind legs come in, tail gets, more bigger and so forth. So it does better in freshwater, but it still hasn't made the transition to marine life. And then you have Ambulocetus, then Rhodocetus, which again has improvements and so forth, and then ultimately you get to Basilos. What is that, Ken?
Basilosaurus.
Basilosaurus, which is a big kind of clunky pre-whale, and then Duraderms, which is more of a streamline, and Duraderms ended up being the precursor. So it's kind of like in 20 million years you have this whale evolution, which is like a lunch break in evolutionary time, which is just amazing. And Berlinski's thing was, you have to have so many adaptations because you're in salt water. Salt water is deadly to mammals that are used to fresh water. So you have that problem. You have the eye has to be, because he's underwater all the time in salt water, that has to be changed. You have kidney filtering, which has to occur. You have, when they have their young, you have to have a certain vent to cool the reproductive thing.
How about being able to dive to deep depths and the pressure?
A mile down. I mean, how does that happen? So, if you guys got answers, I'm listening.
Well, part of my perspective, and I want to hear from all of you guys, but it wasn't exactly what I was expecting as a book. It seemed to be it was reminiscent. How many of you were here when we did the book? What was the name of the book? We had. It was on the guy who wrote the book, There Is a God. Anthony Flew. When we interviewed Gary Habermas talked about that right after one of the debates that he was talking to Flew, and it suddenly occurred to Flew, and this is in the hallway after the debate, Flew said he just realized that he had not made any positive case for atheism. All he did was critique the Christian or the theistic worldview. And I felt like that was the primary focus of this book. He was very critical of what he perceived to be unanswered questions in atheism, but he didn't really provide, I didn't feel like, an alternative viewpoint, or an evidence for an alternative viewpoint. There was a time, and if I have time to get to it, I'll share with you later, where he did talk about that he felt like that atheism had painted themselves in the corner as either atheism or nothing, and not looking at other alternatives. But I just kind of felt like I was hoping to see more of okay, here's my case to be made, and all I saw mostly was here's another problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. Did anybody else kind of sense that?
Yeah, it's funny.
That's the whole premise of intelligent design. There's not a positive case other than proving a negative case against evolution.
But even with intelligent design, I think that most people in the Discovery Institute are going to say there's a designer. I don't think he wants to go that far, so...
Well, he believes in intelligent design because he's with the Discovery Institute.
But he doesn't really hold to it.
Yeah, he does.
He says he doesn't.
Oh, he says he does, I thought.
Well, no, there's a quote in the book where he sort of agrees with the phrase that somebody came up with, that creationism or intelligent design is creationism in a cheap tuxedo.
Oh, he says that.
He affirms that comment kind of tongue in cheek. He says, yeah, sort of.
But he works for the Discovery Institute. How can
I've got a video clip where I think he says something along the lines of that he doesn't embrace it, but he finds places of commonality. He even compares it to one of his ex-wives or something. I have the clip, and I'll share that later.
He's not going to put the cheerleading clothes on and dance a jig to it, but I think he's
warming up to intelligent design.
Yeah, because I think there's something. And I agree with you, James, that the book is a critique, and if you just go into it expecting that, he doesn't make any pretensions about offering a solution. He's simply critiquing a lot of the assumptions, which I think it's an excellent book, and it serves to get past the standard fare of arguments that are presented in favor of what we might call scientism today. And on page 3, he invokes subtly vasta mole superbus, which is Samuel Johnson's phrase about his own dictionary that he wrote in 1755, and it means proud in its prodigious bulk. In other words, so Johnson was very pleased that he had completed this thing. And so, in a sense, he quotes this after Weinberg, and in a sense I think that's what he's talking about with science, that science has amassed this amount of evidence, and we are proud of its prodigious bulk of information we've uncovered. And it kind of sits, for Berlinski, it all kind of sits as a doctrine that goes unchallenged, uncritically challenged. And so I think he sees himself as being able to at least offer some cracks to this, the sacredness, I guess, of scientism and of scientific fact. That's what I perceive.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. I think that's what he was attempting to do.
Yeah, if you go reading it, that you think he's going to try to offer you an answer to the questions he raises. It's not what he's doing at all. Yeah.
I would think it'd be interesting to have a debate between Francis Collins and David Berlinski.
That would be fascinating, wouldn't it? Oh man.
Yeah. Anybody else want to share something or comment or observation, maybe?
Well, it seemed like his book was targeted, he has obviously playing on God delusion, and really seems to be talking towards people who think, not just respect science, but think that science can solve all our problems, or can go so far as to disprove the existence of God, which I obviously can't speak for scientists as a whole, but I think it's probably more of an outlier position. I would think there's a lot more people who would say that science really can't speak to the question of God. It might be able to disprove certain claims about God, but it's not really the same domain either. It's focused on the natural world, not the supernatural.
I think he's poking, that's a good point, and I think it's interesting, there's an analogy I could make. So in 2004, Barbara Mikulski, you guys know the senator from Maryland, she's no longer a senator, but she spoke in 2004 at the Space Telescope Science Institute on the public revealing of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, which was an image of 10,000 galaxies. And she spoke in the opening for a couple of minutes, and what got the largest, I don't know if it was a standing ovation because you don't see the crowd, but it's an enthusiastic cheering. She had promised as a senator to give more funding to Hubble, and that got the most applause out of anything else that she had said. And so the analogy that I'm drawing here, I think, is that Mikulski spent more time talking about the technology and the telescope than what it actually uncovered. And so I think Berlinski is sort of critiquing that it's not about the technology so much, it's not about the science, but we tend to look at the domain or the paradigm of science and everything that it has done, and we look at the edifice of science, the tool, and not what science the tool has actually looked. So we look at science and we lose our vision of creation. And I think Berlinski's book is a helpful kick in the shorts that, hey, it's not about the telescope. One of the gentlemen that we were going to work with in our book, when he came to Texas, we were thinking about a public graphic presentation for promoting the event at Southwestern. And I said, why don't we use an image of the telescope? And Dr. Kokomor said, it's not about the telescope. And I was like, yeah. I think that's what Berlinski's getting at without so much as saying, well, what is it all about? But I think he's showing that it's certainly not all about the science as we've come to understand and accept it uncritically. Yeah. So it's a refreshing...
Several places he seemed to critique the idea, the kind of a popular idea, that science has disproven God, and that neither the premises or none of the conclusions actually have the word God in it, but it's like extrapolation. Mm-hmm. If this is true scientifically, then there is no God. Well, that was not, God was not in what we were investigating.
Right. So the telescope was, the telescope example is, we didn't see God in the Hubble, right? So therefore he must not exist. Yeah. This is the mentality of, I didn't know we were building a telescope to find God. I didn't know people at JPL knew what kind of sensors and monitors to put in for divine essence on the telescope.
Who says that, though? That's a strong...
It is. No, it is. But it is very, and I'm saying not here, but it's a very predominant idea. I hear it all the time on the internet or Twitter or Facebook.
Well, the cosmologist, what was the cosmonaut who said launch into orbit?
Well, okay, there's another story there because Yuri and Khrushchev
Yuri Gagarin.
You put the words, those were Khrushchev's words that Khrushchev said, Gagarin said, but Gagarin was actually a believer.
Oh, really?
Yes. This is actually a chapter in our book, and this is the only reason I know this. But Khrushchev had said that we didn't see God, as if to say, what is the leader of the Soviet Union saying that I didn't know you guys went up there looking for God, right? But again, that
line that I've heard from
childhood,
I know.
Yeah,
it's like it gets a lot of mileage, but not most people in my sphere of non-believers wouldn't put forth such a strange suggestion.
No, but
as an analogy, though, I think that's what some of what Berlinski was trying to say is you're using the wrong tools to come to that conclusion. So it's like the analogy that I don't believe other galaxies exist. I have the world's finest microscope and haven't been able to find them yet.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Well, James, to the point that you started there, I felt like Berlinski started a point and didn't finish it. Maybe I missed something, but he started out with the premise that people think of science as a thing, and there is no thing called science. And I think that's an important point because, not to this educated group here, but a lot of people out there in the world think, well, there's science versus God, but science is not just a thing. It's just a whole bunch of data in different fields and different methodologies, and So I think maybe people set up kind of an unfair debate there, right?
Yeah, he says on page 60 exactly what you're saying, Conrad. He says, the claim that the existence of God should be treated as a scientific question stands on a destructive dilemma. If by science one means the great theories of mathematical physics, then the demand is unreasonable. We cannot treat any claim in this way. There is no other intellectual activity in which the theory and evidence have reached this stage of development. In other words, he's simply saying what you just said, that there's the idea that God must be demonstrably provable is not the underlying cause or purpose or intent or wise use of science.
Or even the fact that, even the idea that sociology and physics and chemistry and math are even the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, why are they even, lumped together?
The idea of
thing, right?
quantifying our knowledge and existence, right? I grade English papers for middle school. I used to do that. How do you put a 78 on a child's essay on Chronicles of Narnia? The idea that we can quantify everything and calculate and classify, and that this is somehow more true and more real than a poem, right? So we're used to like equations or E equals mc squared, but why is E equals mc squared somewhat closer to the reality of the way things are than an Alfred Lloyd Tennyson poem about the Pleiades? Both of them are true in one sense, but I think he's critiquing that dominant paradigm of a mathematical scientific, a kind of mathematical scientific knowledge about everything.
Well, part of the outgrowth of this is not just the science itself, but the fact that through measurement, we've been able to take technology, and technology has become visible and manifested in many things that it does to us. And so, maybe subtly or in other cases where it's more proclaimed, you get you develop a cultural confidence that numbers and the technology and the science behind that is a truism. It is a reality of itself. And so therefore we begin to attribute faith to this thing.
Well, he's a big believer in the hard sciences like mathematics and physics. What do y'all think of his thing on evolutionary psychology? He just has no respect for that. I mean, just totally dishes it.
Yeah, I hope he's got tenure at Princeton because he made a lot of people mad. Pretty insulting, right?
But I've read stuff, and it's about evolutionary psychology, and it's you have certain things that cross cultures and certain personality traits and so forth. When you get mad and you go like this, it's like, why are you gritting your teeth? Are you trying to bite somebody? It's just never really. And Ken and I were talking about snakes. Why do we fear snakes? An evolutionary angle. But it's just hard. How do you test evolutionary psychology and go back to the Pleistocene and those eras and come up with anything?
Why did cavemen do art?
Well, and one girl said the reason women shop is because in cave times they were gatherers. So that's
that explains a lot.
Yes, all of that is post hoc ergo propter hoc reason.
Yeah, that's
it's like so I can look at any event afterwards and.
Why don't you share that in English for us too?
So that's post hoc ergo propter hoc is the Latin phrase for post hoc is after this, therefore, then that.
Just because something follows something earlier doesn't mean that's the cause of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fallacy of false cause is another way of saying that. Yeah. Now, one thing I liked about the book and his videos too, he's got a way with the English language. I mean, he is. He reminds me a lot of some of the older of us will remember William F. Buckley. Doesn't it remind you a little bit of that? And he has a keen wit and a subtle satire. He can get a sarcasm even, but slip it in such a way that it's pretty nice. So.
By the way, if you watch the movie Expelled,
yeah,
he interviews David Berlinski all over the place, and he just sits like this in his Paris apartment, just pontificating. I mean, I wonder what it's like to be the smartest guy ever, and there's nobody. You know what he said about what's his name, Richard Dawkins? If you watch Expelled, he goes, he's kind of a reptile. I mean, how disdainful. I mean, I don't know anybody that he probably looks up to. Maybe Noam Chomsky or whatever. I don't know.
Well, I found a video clip that might address some of this stuff. This is, I think it was 2010 that David Berlinski did a debate with Christopher Hitchens. And the title of the debate was, Atheism Poisons Everything. And that was basically a takeoff of course, the subtitle of Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. So this is kind of the counter to that. And I mean, we could just have watched this whole thing because it was some great gold in this if you watch it. And Christopher Hitchens is at least an equal match, if not better, on the rhetoric side of things. And so, Hitchens, I mean, it's two parts. The whole clip's only 4 minutes, but the first part is the moderator is asking David Berlinski, you know, you're not a Christian, you're not a theist, you know, so you're putting all this out, but you know where are you coming from? What's your alternative? Kind of what we talked about earlier. You know, what is his answer then? If it's not evolution, or if it's not, you know, what is it? And then the other part, I just, it continued right on, and I kept it on there just to be equal time. We have Christopher Hitchens countering with Christ's most evil and poisonous teaching. So I thought you'd really want to hear what that was. So, are you ready for that first video? Let's watch that now.
Dr. Berlinski, you're a Christian, and indeed you're not religious, as I understand it. Why do you argue for the influence of Christianity, or a Judeo-Christian influence in society?
I presume you're not asking that in the hopes of a personal declaration. I mean, I argue for a great many things, and my personal involvement in topics for debate is variable. This particular question strikes me as more important and more demanding of a personal involvement than most. I think the issue is tremendously significant. I think if we're honest about the times in which we live, it's quite right what Matthew Arnold suggested. The sea of faith has been receding under the power of a variety of forces, and the results have, in a certain way, been catastrophic for the human race. I should not say that a secular Jew has a remarkable degree of authority when it comes to discussing these events. After all, I have lived my own life under the impress of the maxim to have a good time all the time. But on the other hand, it doesn't hurt to hear these words from someone such as myself, because at least you are hearing these words for someone with no conceivable bias in their favor. I count myself as an objective observer of the circumstances. So perhaps that's the only reasonable answer I can give. These are important questions. They've had horrific consequences in human history. They continue to have horrific consequences, especially in intellectual history. And in response to why should it be that a secular Jew opens his mouth on questions pertaining to the Christian religion?
10 seconds.
It's a big tent. I'm presuming I will be welcome. Thank you.
Christopher Hitchens, what specific teachings of Jesus do you believe to be evil or poisonous?
The concept of vicarious redemption is the most repulsive, I think, and the most central. I mean, I could pick a lot of peripheral utterances of the Nazarene, or alleged utterances of the Nazarene, but the inescapable one, the one that none of his followers troubles to deny, that he is the idea that by throwing your sins onto somebody else, onto a scapegoat, you can have them annealed, polished. That is a disgusting and immoral doctrine. If I care for you enough, I can pay your debt, even if you incurred it out of your own stupid irresponsibility. I could, if I wished, and it's been done, offer to take your place in prison, though not many people will allow the exchange, or if you were hostage. I could do that if I loved you enough, and there are examples of people willing to put themselves forward as the substitute for someone's execution. I suppose Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities is the best known folkloric one, but you cannot relieve people of their responsibilities. and it's immoral to offer to do so, and it would be disgusting if it could be done. So the moral rot of Christianity is, I think, exposed in its central doctrine of vicarious forgiveness. So it's an abdication of moral responsibility. I think.
Okay, well, first of all, on David Berlinski, what was his answer? As a secular Jew, what is he doing trying to defend, or...
It
almost sounded...
Huh?
Do as I say, not as I do.
It almost sounded, it almost sounded like, well, he feels that secularism has caused problems in the world, and he ties it to that. And while it's not needed, I don't need it. The rest of you of the unwashed masses, you guys obviously need something to keep you straight. And so from that, that would be a intellectually honest position to argue from.
What was his point at the very end, where he talks about a big fence or something?
The big tent. Yeah. He's just saying there's a lot of people arguing this. That's how I took it. That there's a lot of people arguing, the various apologetics or various, knocking of science, and he felt like there was a big tent, and he would be welcome regardless of his personal position.
I thought he was maybe implying big tent, like maybe if Christianity is true, he squeaks in as a
maybe.
I don't know. So it was interesting because he certainly seems to be trying to not just discount some of the claims of evolution, but also trying to support the idea of a creator, both on moral grounds and scientific grounds. So it's almost like, okay, if it's such a compelling argument, why don't you buy it? I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
That was my question, exactly.
He goes into the book, he spends the whole chapter talking about, and then this is not unique to him, but he talks about the ravages of Stalin and Hitler and these regimes that
he goes on and on
atheistic in nature, and I don't remember if he actually makes the case why these regimes are an inevitable result of atheism and not just people, because you could point to Christian atrocities. I don't do that because there are also Christians who do good things, and there's not any reason to focus on individuals when you can talk about the truth, the doctrines, and argument for consequences, not actually establishing what's factual.
Later in that interview, I mean the debate, I showed you the clip of just now, Christopher Hitchens takes him apart for making that parallel, and just basically he gets, what do they call it?
He talks about the French Revolution.
When Christopher Hitchens puts you in your place, what do they call that?
Hitch
slapped. He gets roundly hitch slapped in that part of the debate.
But he talks about the Temple of Reason or something in France and how it turned into this.
Well, the French Revolution. I mean, he goes through. He has that chart. Remember, close to the front of the book, where he talks about all the people who died. I couldn't figure out what order it was going in. It wasn't chronological.
You talking about this one?
Yeah.
That he's responding to Steven Pinker's claim about the happiness and the morality and the progress of the 20th and 21st century. Mm-hmm. So he's not. I don't think he's holding atheists accountable to this standard. But I think he's.
Read Pinker.
I think he's holding Pinker, or he's trying to hold Pinker accountable to the idea.
Yeah.
Well, he has that block.
Pinker is the better angels of our.
Yeah. Well, Pinker lays out a very strong case that things have gotten better over the millennia. Yeah, there have been blips, obviously, but the long-term trend has been, especially since the Enlightenment, has been for improvement on a number of fronts, homicides and wars, and you name it.
Well, I think that's.
But if you look at things as a percentage of the population, which if you're not talking about percentages, yeah, I mean there's huge numbers. You can say 20 million, 40 million here, whatever, but you look back in the time of the 100 Years' War in Christian Europe, you take a third of the people died. So if you took a third of people in Europe who died, and you run the numbers, and that's what you get. So you can't just say, oh well, look at these numbers. You have to look at the proportions. Mm-hmm. And plus the advent of armaments, the rockets and tanks and bombs and things like that. I mean, they didn't have those back in the early 80s. Imagine how much worse things would have been back then. So, yeah, part of it is technology. It's not just ideology. But also, I mean, most Christians don't appreciate comparisons with Muslims. They're both theists. Christians and Muslims are theists. And Muslims are going and marauding or whatever, or Christians don't like to be lumped in with that. Well, I, as an atheist, don't appreciate being lumped in with Stalin. He may share my atheism, perhaps, but that's where it ends. Christians might share theism with Muslims, but that's where it ends.
Well, what I took from that argument wasn't that he was blaming atheism. It's just that people will say, just without thinking, oh, look at all the horrible things done in the name of religion. I hear that all the time, and that's true, but I think, you can look at his numbers and see it's not just in the name of religion. People do horrible things, right?
He says something along the lines of, if you look at nuclear weapons and napalm, and he goes through a whole litany of things, he says very few of these came from the Vatican. They were not invented by the Vatican. So it's, so what did you guys think? Was he trying to say that atheism is somehow to blame for Pol Pot and Stalin and some of the atrocities, or was he just trying to say that the last 200 years have not been the paradise that people try to make it out to be?
I think he was blaming atheism because he drove home the point that people don't believe a supreme being is watching them. Therefore, they're going to get away with what they get away with.
He certainly says that clearly elsewhere in the book. I agree with that.
He does say,
he definitely makes that case.
He does say on page 21, Berlinski says this: if the facts about the 20th century are an inconvenience for scientific atheism, suitably informed thought may always find a way to deny them. And then he goes on to quote Steven Pinker. Do you want me to read the whole Steven Pinker thing? You have time to do that, or you want to?
Yeah, just read it.
Okay, so this is the block quote that that follows the death list that he puts on page 22 and 23.
The facts about the 20th century are an inconvenience for scientific atheism.
Oops, sorry.
Suitably informed thought may always find a way to deny them. And then he goes on to quote Steven Pinker.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the Pinker quote that follows the list. He says, Steven Pinker's words: cruelty as entertainment, human sacrifice to indulge superstition, slavery as a labor-saving device, conquest as the mission statement of government, genocide as a means of acquiring real estate, torture and mutilation as routine punishment, the death penalty for misdemeanors and differences of opinion, assassination as the mechanism of political succession, rape as the spoils of war, pogroms as outlets for frustration, homicide as the major form of conflict resolution. All were unexceptionable features of life for most of human history, but today they are rare to non-existent in the West, far less common elsewhere than they used to be, concealed when they do occur, and widely condemned when they are brought to light. And then that's when Mr. Berlinski goes on to list the millions and millions of people that have died in wars and conflicts in the 20th and 21st century. And then he says, considering Pinker's assessment of the times in which we live, the only conclusion one can profitably draw is that such an excess of stupidity is not often to be found in nature.
Well, he's stupid too, because
yeah, that's not like you.
Again, what do you really think?
What do you really think?
percentages, homicide rates and warfare rates were much higher hundreds of years ago than they were even in the 20th century. You can't just list a bunch of numbers and say he's stupid.
Yeah,
but
I would take issue with that on a couple of points. One point being that if you subscribe to the idea that things are progressive, evolution is progressive, we're getting smarter, et cetera, and our technology is smarter, you'd kind of have to ask the question, why in the 20th century did over 100 million innocent people die primarily due to ideological conflicts? That doesn't count the deaths, combative deaths in World War II and World War I, and I've added these up as best we can. So that seems to say there's some problematic issues. Now, most of those were in authoritative regimes, which were atheistic. And the issue is, somebody once told me that who your God is whoever is your ultimate authority.
He makes that point too. He makes the point that if you have no higher authority that you can appeal to other than yourself.
Right, and so if the state, if you're seceding yourself as a slave to the state as the higher authority, then you're justified in killing all the priests in Tibet and taking over that country to liberate the people. You're justified for almost anything that higher authority wants you to do. You have no other moral appeal.
But what about Ken's point, though? If you look at it as a percentage, see, part of it is we have such an information age. We know about all this, so there's atrocities taking place in history we have no knowledge of because they killed them all. And so in the news media that we have now, and we know about how many people died, how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. We know how many people died in World War I. We have that information. But if you multiply that by the world population being in the billions, and then look at the past, it may be a better picture, which is what I think was his point.
Well, I would think that's giving some credence to Stalin's statement that, you know, killing 1 or 2 people is murder, but killing 20,000 is just a statistic. I think the issue is if innocent people are being mass killed, you know, whether it's 2% of the population or 10% of the population, it's a moral traumatic situation, and it should be questioned.
I don't think anybody was saying it's a good thing, but just the question is was it getting better or worse? I think that's the only
And over time it's been getting better.
Yeah.
That's objectively true.
So I think the argument, sorry, let me take this out. I think the argument is just, he said, he was going into the fact that we hear a lot of atheists here say, well, obviously theism is bad because look at all the bad things come from theism.
Right.
And what I think his argument was, if I understood correctly, was just, well, look at these atheistic dictators who used atheism to justify their position. I don't think he's saying necessarily atheism does justify the position,
right.
But just you can't say this is false because Christians have misused it, or Muslims, or just theists in general.
Yeah.
Well, even
just
if
like
you
you can't say
there's
with
so many
atheists.
factors.
Say if you're,
I think
say if you're-
Glenn has something for us here.
yeah, say if your worldview did produce these kinds of results, to use that as an argument to say, to speak to the truth value of that view, seems like a non sequitur. This seems like an appeal to, what's the word?
Consequences or-
Well, yeah, but it's pragmatism. To say that it's very similar to like a genetic fallacy, but kind of reversed. So on one hand, you say with the genetic fallacy that where the view comes from, you know, you produce this fallacy of saying, well, where it came from, I don't like, or it was immoral, or it was something's wrong with it, and therefore I don't believe the truth value of the claim itself, the view itself. Well, likewise, if you take a view and you say, well, here's what it produces, and now even if we could show that there's a relationship between those two things, you still got a problem of saying it doesn't actually speak to the truth value of it. It just tells us what, even if people have done rightly, or you know, have kept to that view in what they do and doing evil things, that's still.
So in other words, what you're saying
doesn't change the fact that it's true or false.
So what you're saying is, so like we look at the death penalty and we say that the government has acted and the states have acted to put people to death, does not say whether or not the death penalty is right or wrong. Is that kind of what you're getting at? So we look at the deaths and we say, is that the right thing? They're producing deaths, but are they doing it correctly, or is that kind of what you're getting at?
I don't know how to.
Yeah, if I could, maybe I'm hearing what you're saying. I think there are two issues involved there. First of all, if something's true, it doesn't matter what it's producing. If it's true, it's true. So if it's producing things that we don't enjoy or like, that doesn't make it untrue. The second thing, though, is it kind of begs the question, in a sense, who says that mass murder is bad? So you go back to that issue is, if you pull that away, then you can't use that argument. Well, it can't be true because people are being killed. And whether it's getting better or worse, you're begging the question of if that's a bad or a good thing. There are people who would argue we have too many humans on Earth anyway, and it's a blight on Mother Nature, and we need to reduce the population. And if that means people have to die, they have to die.
So you know that today's Pearl Harbor Day, right?
Yeah.
So
a day that will live in infamy.
Yeah, and you know the famous words that was uttered by Matsuo Fujita, the air commander who led the first squadron, Tora, Tora, Tora. He came in to Pearl Harbor and they bombed Pearl Harbor, and 3,100 American lives were lost. And Fujita describes how he prepared for this, how he executed it flawlessly, and flew back home. And they lost the war and everything, but among those people that he bombed were my mom and her family. They were stationed in Pearl Harbor, and there was a bomb that fell in their backyard. Didn't detonate. But they were in officers' quarters. Anyway, Fujita became a Christian after that, and he went around. He was basically a Japanese Billy Graham after the war. Just an aside there, but you can look at the Pearl Harbor attack and you know, like we can look at Iraq or something, and really what's the plumb line, as somebody, I think you said it, Neil, what's your standard for putting people to death? If the state is the highest authority, then there's no challenging that. And I think you're right, James, in terms of we can't look at how many people are dying and tell us that death is good or bad. It's just what is happening. It's just evolution, right? It's not necessarily bad that people die. It's not necessarily good that people die. There's not necessarily any improvement that people are dying or living. It's just morally neutral.
But that's where I'll just raise the point in the theory of natural law. You come to the point, and a good example of this is the play Sophocles wrote on Antigone, where she buries her brother, even though that was prohibited by Croesus, who I think was the king. And she's suffered, you know, the death for violating that thing. And he asks her, why did you do it? And she says, because there was a higher moral calling to me that stands above anything that people have, that the man has, that I had to take care of my brother in the way that's required. So the issue, we would say theologically, becomes an issue of, is there this higher moral law that exists, A, naturally, or B, from a divine source? And that then gets into the issue of the authority of the state, which is not just the communists, by the way. A parliament has the authority to put someone to death. They don't have a constitution or a trial right like we do in the United States. If Parliament signs a death certificate, you can be executed, and the people who do it are absolved of any crime. They're not prosecutable. So, you know, the ultimate authority and the moral issues that go with that are very pertinent to any society, and ours are, we see that in the recent history no less than they did in the 1500s.
I've got another clip, unless somebody wants to share something or ask something. This is coming from Socrates in the City, I think 2012 or 13, something like that. This is David Berlinski. I have another part maybe after the break we can look at as well. It's only about 6 minutes long. But I'd like to kind of watch this and then discuss, you know, what he brings up here. So let's watch this clip.
That's one example. I would like to be allowed to offer you a few other examples. In the 18th century, a French philosopher, very clever, said, look, I've got a button here, right on my table. You press this button, you get anything you want, anything. Untold riches, the love of beautiful women, inexhaustible power, anything you want. The only slight impediment is that 10,000 miles away in China, a peasant will drop dead in his tracks. You will cause his death. The question that he raised is, who amongst us would refrain from pressing the button? And who amongst us would be content to have that button in wide currency? I've always thought that was a profound moral question. A profound moral question. A few years ago, and we're now spanning 300 years, a well-known cosmologist, speaking off the cuff, as almost everyone who says anything interesting about cosmology speaks off the cuff because the official doctrine is so absurd. Speaking off the cuff said, you know, I understand quantum mechanics and I sort of get all this stuff, but you know, I have a simple-minded question. And you know, when anybody ever says I have a simple-minded question, the question is not simple-minded, he's just embarrassed to ask it. Tell me, he talked to other cosmologists, tell me, You got the electron, right? It's going around, whiz, 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 and it follows an orbit. And that orbit determines the chemistry of ordinary life. And that electron does the same thing all the time. What compels the electron to stay in its orbit? Notice the choice of words. What compels the electron to stay in its orbit? Notice the resonance. What compels us not to press the button? Notice the questions are the same. What is the source of binding compulsion, whether in the moral life or in physical life? Notice at once this transgresses the boundaries of Galileo's universe. This is not uniquely a question about the book of God's work, because we're talking about a moral issue. This is not uniquely a question about the physical world for the same reason. And yet, when you look at the logical form of the question, what compels the electron? Again and again and again. And what's stopping you from pushing that button, killing a Chinese peasant, and making yourself infinitely rich? There is some compulsive force at work that we all recognize, but cannot name. There are attempts in the literature to make that clear, but they've all been failures. For example, we might say that the laws of nature owe their compelling force to their logical form. They're necessary, just like the laws of logic. The trouble with that theory is they're not necessary. We can very easily imagine an alternative to the laws of nature as we understand them. And by the same token, we cannot say the laws of moral life, the compelling force that stops us from killing an innocent victim simply to enrich ourselves, are necessary. They could be otherwise. We cannot appeal to necessity of any logical sort in order to make this point. Well, then maybe nothing determines it. Maybe we live in a nihilistic intellectual world. Okay, that's a possibility too. But are you prepared to say, ladies and gentlemen, that for this reason, a question like, what compels the electron to follow its orbit, is meaningless? I don't think so. We recognize the question as deeply significant. Here we stand at a very considerable remove from what Galileo thought of as the book of God's work. We're reaching questions that the book cannot answer and that its interpreters cannot read. It is quite true that the scientific community believes you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. But that is a maxim that cuts two ways, doesn't it? There's nothing preventing us from saying, with respect to the scientific community, here are questions, and we are prepared to say, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting, because you cannot answer the questions that haunt and oppress us. That's the second example, it seems to me.
Well, who wants to push a button?
Well, you know, in war, we'll drop a bomb on 10,000 civilians because we say it'll save 1 million lives. If somebody pushed a button and killed one person, and they had the wealth to save tens of thousands of others, that would be a hard choice not to make.
And it's not even wealth. He said, what would compel you to push the button? Well, I think everybody's going to have a different set of answers. They're going to do that mental calculus against whatever moral truths they hold, and then decide, is this an example, my wife of 50 years or something is all of a sudden dying of something horrible. Am I now willing to push that button to save her life? at the expense of somebody around the world, that's a different answer for me than can I have, more wealth than I can imagine if I push the button. There may be a different calculus there. So
You have an interesting short story right there.
What?
You've got an interesting short story to write with that.
I think they may have done that
I'm
in
sorry,
Black
go
Mirror.
It reminds me of the trolley dilemma. Is anybody familiar with that?
Share it with us.
Yeah.
Well, you imagine it's a thought experiment where there's a trolley going down the tracks, and there's 5 people lying. The tracks diverge. There's a fork in the tracks, and this trolley is going to go one way or the other, but it's veering towards the track that has 5 people lying on it. It's going to kill 5 people. Or you can flip a switch and make it go to the left-hand side where there's 1 person on the trolley. The details may differ, but basically, if you didn't do anything, you'd be consigning 5 people to die. But if you did something, you would kill that 1 person. So it's a similar idea.
Which there's a variant on that, which most people, I guess, would push the button to save the 5 at the cost of the 1. But if the choice was, and all these mental gymnastics that go into this is fascinating, but if the choice was now, or if the decision you had to make was not to push a button to switch the train, but to push a person over into the path of the train that would stop it. So you'd kill this person, you would physically push this person in front of the train to save those people. Most people wouldn't do that. Same calculus as far as count, 5 to 1, but you pushing somebody versus pushing a button to change the direction of the train.
They've also found that the odds change whenever you're the person on the track. Like, and it's funny, but it's also like they have factored that in multiple times.
Josh McDowell does a survey on ethics amongst, I think it was high school students. It may have been college, but I think it was high school students. And I don't know how many were surveyed. I don't know how scientific it was, but it was if there was a human and your favorite dog both drowning in the same lake and you can only save 1, which would you do? And it was, if I remember correctly, divided about the same way, 3 parts. A third of them would save the human that they didn't know. A third of them would save their own dog, and the last third found the question too difficult to answer.
But it reminded me of that famous old black and white movie. I can't remember the name, where Orson Welles and the guy are up in the Ferris wheel in post-war Vienna, and he tells him, look at those little dots moving around down there. Now, if one of them would stop moving, would that really mean anything to you? Because he was being criticized for selling bad penicillin. So it's a great scene in the movies, kind of asking the same question: what does it matter to you?
I think it's interesting too that
the Third Man. That's the name.
Third Man, yeah. The idea that he brings up of, I really love the point about he makes with language and law, and he does touch on this in the book too, which reminded me of something Paul Davies has said not too long ago. But he brings up the idea of law in physics, of course, and just really quickly, this is not something that Berlinski quotes, but this is something Paul Davies says, who's a physicist. He says, the very notion of physical law has its origin in theology. The idea of absolute, universal, perfect, immutable laws comes straight out of monotheism, which was the dominant influence in Europe at the time. Science, as we know it, was being formulated by Isaac Newton and his contemporaries. And so for Davies, he doesn't like this metaphor, which ultimately is a metaphor, because the universe by itself does not write stricture, and Davies says that he believes that this entire line of reasoning is now outdated and simplistic. And Berlinski's point to this in the book was, he says, and this is on page XIV, this is in the intro, Berlinski notes that if science stands opposed to religion, it is not because of anything contained in either the premises or the conclusions of the great scientific theories. Confident assertions by scientists that in the privacy of their chambers they have demonstrated that God does not exist have nothing to do with science and even less to do with God's existence. But I think he raises an interesting point in that video clip. Why do we speak of, if the world is purely naturalistic, why did natural selection or evolution bequeath us with a language that only speaks of it as though it was teleological? It's a very curious point. Because we can't escape describing the universe without teleological language. Even if you want to call it a metaphor, we're still seem to be bound to be able to say words like compel I mean, how else do you explain something without saying words like this? And so you look at the science of physics or natural selection, and there are descriptions in the abstracts about how whatever the forces are shaping, guiding, leading, and directing. There's this language all over the place in teleology. So I think that's an excellent point that he brings up.
I'll raise my hand for anybody else that doesn't know what the word teleology is.
It's purpose, intention.
Design.
Design
Okay.
and purpose and
The
intention.
end, the end.
So Jim, if I were to ask you, what's the universe for? Does the universe have a purpose? You look at, so how does scientist look at the universe and say the universe has no purpose, or it does have a purpose? And Berlinski's point is, isn't it interesting that the language that we use to describe the universe seems to be chock full of teleology and purpose?
But hasn't that changed also over time? You know, I mean, models now.
Models change, yes.
Models change. You know, it's our best guess, but then we learn more, and the model has to be
Right.
modified and refined.
Even though the models are refined, the language is still very similar. We can't.
Right, but-
we can't escape describing the planets and things as though there's.
We call it laws, but
Yeah,
they're really
right.
models, right? I guess that's where I was going.
Right,
to say
well, that's what I'm saying,
That
but
you're
the-
making
Yeah.
you're making the point that, you know, science has traditionally called things the law of this,
That's a
the
model.
law of that,
That's
but it's a model.
Sure. No,
And-
the law language is a model. But
Okay.
my point with Davies is frustrated with this model and wants to come up with something else. And what's interesting is that Davies says, what's his thing? He says, can we do better than this? Yes, but only by relinquishing the traditional idea of physical laws as fixed, perfect relationships. I propose instead that the laws are more like computer software programs being run on the great cosmic computer. So even when Davies is suggesting a huge metaphorical paradigm shift, he's still right back to the use of teleological language.
Well, yeah. Computer programs have a purpose and they have an author.
Yeah, I mean, so the point is that Berlinski seems to be saying, shame on you, audience, for being unable to answer these questions that we're posing to ourselves about being compelled. It does seem like there is strong evidence that things are compelled to do certain things. But darn it, some people hate the language that we are using to describe this. It doesn't seem to be any other way to do it, and that's really interesting.
I think it's right. It's a fundamental issue with Darwinian evolution, because you know, if you take the premise that things are accidental, okay, and a random material deterministic view, that there's no reason in the world why there aren't all sorts of broken things laying all over the place. So for example, in programs, you wouldn't have a coherent set of programs. You'd have all kinds of broken programs all over the place, because there's no rational expectation that things will work. It's random.
Things die.
I would argue that with saying it's the modifications are random, but most of them fail. Most of them do fail. In other words,
and that's right. But the evidence is, where's all the failures?
Well, we all have every one of us has like 30,000 genetic defects. If you were to perfectly match our parents' genes together, each person, I think, and this is a little old, but so each one of us has a modification of what you would expect if those two genes were perfectly matched.
Some of you have more than that.
That's within.
Yes.
But that's within a kind. If you're saying that everything sprung from an amoeba somewhere and developed whales and 4 different kinds of whales, and there's got to be a scion of things.
They're not
that are
defects.
all over the
They're not
damn place.
defects anymore.
It's not a defect.
They're just like, I'm a
whichever
new species because now I have different genes. I'm just perhaps a prototype of a new species. It's not defectual. There's nothing.
That's bad language.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying but the idea that, okay, so I have some genetics in accordance with a standard that is comparable to what? By evolutionary
a variation, then maybe.
Yeah, a variation,
and then the variation does it. Most variations would not do anything in a single generation. Whatever variations that I received, because it wasn't a perfect sync up of how you would expect the genes to zip together. Do those variations actually allow me to survive or provide me some type of benefit in whatever the environment is? The environment changes, and under the current environment, maybe whatever I receive does no good, but maybe in 20 years and we have some dramatic change, maybe I receive something that does give me a slight advantage or something.
But see, to the point that he was just raising, that the issue is, you've made the assumption there will be a coherent result, and you can't.
That's the irony.
You can't make that
There's
assumption.
no such assumption in evolutionary
Well,
biology.
what he just said is if these variations, blah, 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 through those, and it matures and evolves to this point, you are making an implicit assumption that there will be a coherent result. And if it's pure accidental, you just can't make that assumption.
No, evolutionary biologists don't make that assumption.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I seem to
Well,
see it.
I think another something that begs the question, I think, is so you look at the taxonomy of biological life. You have the tree of life or the wheel now that they've so wonderfully constructed its artwork into and of itself. But the idea that we can even classify the amount of living organisms and be able to say within this species, kingdom, phylum, whatever, that we have these particular genetic traits or phenotypes and genotypes, and that you can, that these things can be classified. The classification scheme itself, to me, belies naturalism.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if these things were as random and dysfunctional, I say not dysfunctional, but unintentional, I think that we would have a hard time coming up with such an intricate classification scheme.
Well, common descent requires a classification like that.
Well, not on naturalism. It doesn't predict it.
Common descent is an assumption.
Yeah, it is. It's an ad hoc looking backward that we've commonly descended, but there's nothing. There's no
evolutionist. I think you could always make a construct to classify whatever.
Yeah, but that you certainly could. But the idea that biological life is classified to such detail in terms of now what we know that Darwin didn't even know, that we can classify genetics along these same lines, is to me it just seems like it belies the whole premise of naturalism. We wouldn't expect. I mean, would you be able to predict such a hierarchy of taxonomies on naturalism, given nothing?
If evolution is true, then it demands common descent, right? I mean, you can't have evolutionary theory without common descent.
But that's looking. Do you think? Yeah, but is that looking backwards on top of everything?
If you're evaluating evolution as a theory,
yeah.
Okay, you're just wondering, is this true or not? Okay, well, if it's true, you've got to have variation with descent and modification.
Sure.
Which involves nesting of hierarchies. So just like language, you're going to have, if you have evolution of language from Latin to Spanish to Italian to Portuguese and French, you're going to have a nested hierarchy of descent, just like you do in anything that has descent with modification.
Is that hierarchy, the descent with modification, though, is an assumption, is a mechanistic assumption looking backwards, though?
Well, how else can you look at data except to look back at it?
Well, you have to look back at it and interpret that modification has occurred that way from a common ancestor. That's the assumption.
But that's the frustration of Davies, as I understood it.
Yeah.
His frustration is we can't get out of this inbuilt logic that we have.
That's Davies' frustration at all. It seems too logical.
That says that there is an end and a conclusion, and we can't. Now, I would suggest there's theological reasons for that. But the issue is, that is the problem that we have with evolution and a lot of the science is they're going to force a conclusion because you have to have a coherent model that you're going to work against.
Well, and here's the assumption. Here's where the assumption of descent with modification comes into play for modern cosmology, because it actually follows forward for modern cosmology. So a couple of days ago, the OSIRIS-REx satellite landed on the asteroid Bennu. It was launched in October of 2016. It was successfully landed on the asteroid a couple of days ago. It was pretty cool. It's $1 billion enterprise to send this thing to an asteroid. Now, why did they send a satellite to an asteroid? Well, here's from NASA's website about this $1 billion satellite. It's pretty cool. But this is what NASA's justification for what they're doing this. And this is assuming what we've been just talking about. He says the purpose, and this is from NASA, the purpose of the mission is that it seeks answers to the questions that are central to the human experience. Where did we come from? What is our destiny? Asteroids, the leftover debris from the solar system's formation process, can answer these questions and teach us about the history of the sun and planets.
Hooey.
And that's looking backwards, assuming that's $1 billion investment that assumes the gradual, developmental, progressive, evolutionary development of life.
Absolutely.
Let's do this at this point. It's time for a break. We're going to take about 10 minutes, grab a cup of coffee, restroom, Facebook Live people, hang with us. Be sure to get your questions in. We'll take it on the other side. I got another video clip for us, and we have the grand announcement of our book for January.
Wouldn't it be great to have a book that explained evolution?
Yeah.
From what you guys are saying.
So let's take a break.
From a Christian?
I think there's a few of them out there.
Let's go 10 minutes, and we'll be back in 10.